Ambassador Vesik Thara had been briefed in exhaustive detail that the small red object on his plate was a chemical weapon disguised as food. He picked it up anyway. The briefing hadn't been wrong, exactly. It had simply been wrong about what kind of weapon it was, and wrong about what a species that had survived its own history of fire, ice, plague, and each other would consider a threat worth flinching from. 3 seconds after the pepper touched his tongue, Vesik Thara's entire nervous system did something no Drenari physiology report had ever predicted. And in the stunned silence that followed, with his eyes streaming and his 4-chambered heart hammering against his ribs, and half the room certain they were about to watch a senior galactic diplomat die at a state dinner, he opened his eyes, looked directly at his human hosts, and asked, in a voice thick with something that sounded impossibly close to joy, for a second helping. That single sentence, translated, transcribed, and eventually memorized by children on 11 different worlds, would end up doing more for human Drenari relations than 8 months of formal negotiations had managed to accomplish. The footage reached the public within 18 hours, and the reaction, across both human and Drenari media, was immediate and almost giddy in its intensity. Human news networks ran the clip on a loop for days, commentators laughing through tears of their own as they replayed the moment an alien ambassador, streaming and gasping, asked for seconds. Late-night hosts built entire monologues around it. A popular hot sauce company, within a week, had already trademarked the phrase, "It burns beautifully," for a new product line, an act of commercial opportunism that Vesik Thara, when asked about it by a reporter, found genuinely delightful rather than exploitative. "I am told this is what your culture calls a meme," he said, in an interview clip that itself became almost as widely shared as the original dinner footage. "I do not fully understand the concept, but I understand that my choice at that table has apparently made a great many humans happy, and that seems on balance like an excellent use of one uncomfortable evening." On Drenari networks, the reaction carried a different texture, less comedic, more contemplative, filtering through a culture that understood, instinctively, exactly what kind of choice Vesik had made at that table even before the biochemistry was explained. Drenari commentators drew comparisons to the Kessa crossing almost immediately, long before Vesik's own report used the same language, recognizing in the footage something culturally familiar even though the specific stimulus was entirely alien to them. Threshold trial instructors on Osravel began referencing the dinner in their own teaching within weeks, using it as a case study for adolescents preparing for their own crossings. Proof, delivered from an entirely unexpected direction, that the instinct toward chosen hardship was not uniquely Drenari after all. The trouble had started long before the dinner. It had started, in fact, the moment a Drenari long-range survey drone quietly slipped into Earth's outer system 11 months earlier, cataloging the strange new species the wider galaxy had been cautiously observing since the Colossi ceasefire made headlines across a dozen allied systems. The Drenari were not warriors. They were scholars, traders, and above all, survivors, an ancient species who had clawed their way up from a harsh, resource-poor homeworld through sheer stubborn ingenuity, and who now occupied a careful, deliberate place in galactic affairs as brokers, analysts, and cautious observers of anyone powerful enough to be worth watching closely. And after the Colossi Dominion's retreat from human space became public knowledge, the Drenari High Assembly had decided humanity was worth watching very closely indeed. Their survey drone did what Drenari survey drones always did. It collected data, atmospheric samples, communication intercepts, and because Drenari intelligence doctrine considered nothing beneath thorough cataloging, biological samples pulled quietly from human waste processing facilities and agricultural runoff near a dozen major cities. Buried in that mountain of unremarkable data was a compound that made Drenari analysts sit up very straight in their chairs. Capsaicin. To a Drenari biochemist, capsaicin looked on paper exactly like what it was to nearly every other carbon-based life form in known space. A defensive neurotoxin, evolved by a plant to punish anything foolish enough to eat it, engineered by millions of years of selective pressure to bind directly to pain receptors and trigger an unmistakable, universal signal. This will hurt you. Stop immediately. What made the Drenari analysts sit up straighter still was the follow-up data. Human agricultural records showed that this neurotoxin wasn't merely tolerated by the species growing it. It was cultivated, bred over thousands of years into hundreds of increasingly potent varieties, traded internationally at premium prices, rated on a human-invented scale by intensity, a scale that, as far as Drenari analysts could tell, existed specifically so humans could brag to each other about how much of it they had voluntarily consumed. The report that reached the Drenari High Assembly 2 weeks later carried a classification usually reserved for confirmed weapons programs. Potential biochemical threat, species-wide voluntary exposure pattern, intent unclear. Nobody on the assembly floor could agree on what intent unclear actually meant. But every possible explanation on the table was alarming in its own way. High Analyst Corveth ISS, who had built a 40-year career interpreting exactly this kind of anomaly, presented 3 competing theories to the assembly, none of them reassuring. The first theory was the simplest. Humans had, through some quirk of evolution nobody yet understood, developed an unusually high resistance to a compound that incapacitated most other species, and had weaponized their own resistance into a systematic cultural practice, possibly as a filtering mechanism, a way of testing resilience within their own population, possibly as a deliberate signal to potential rivals about exactly how much punishment the human body could absorb without breaking. The second theory was stranger. Some analysts argued the widespread cultivation and voluntary consumption suggested humans might be quietly acclimatizing their population to a specific toxin class, in measured doses, over successive generations. The kind of pattern you'd expect from a species preparing itself, deliberately or not, for eventual exposure to a chemical agent on a much larger scale. Nobody could explain why a species would do that on purpose. Nobody could rule it out either. The third theory, favored by the Assembly's more cautious older members, was the one that eventually shaped policy. Perhaps humans simply did not process pain signals the way every other known species did. Perhaps this new species, barely a year into formal contact with a wider galaxy, already responsible for the single most unexpected military standoff in 1,000 years of Colossi expansion, experienced something during exposure to capsaicin that the rest of known space had no framework for at all, and until the Assembly understood exactly what that something was. Treating it as a potential biological weapons concern was simply the responsible course of action. The loudest voice pushing for the strictest possible response belonged to Assembly Elder Cressa Vol, a veteran security hawk who had spent much of her 40-year career arguing, often correctly, that the Drenari Assembly's cautious, information-gathering approach to unfamiliar species had left them vulnerable more than once in the past. Cressa had not forgotten the Colossi Dominion's own early assessment of humanity, a species dismissed, right up until the asteroid belt engagement, as a minor, unthreatening curiosity. She argued forcefully that any species capable of voluntarily cultivating and consuming a neurotoxin at scale, for reasons the Assembly's best analysts could not confidently explain, deserved exactly the kind of careful skepticism the Colossi had failed to apply and paid for dearly. We do not need to understand their reasons to recognize the pattern, Cressa told the Assembly floor 11 months before the dinner that would eventually prove her wrong. A species that treats self-inflicted pain as entertainment on a planetary scale is a species whose relationship with suffering we do not understand. I would rather delay a treaty by a year than sign one with a partner whose fundamental psychology remains this opaque to us. She did not win the argument outright, but she won enough of it that the 11-month threat assessment and the formal recommendation against unfamiliar produce followed every Drenari diplomat headed for extended human contact, including, 11 months later, a young ambassador named Vesic Thera, who read Kresovol's warning carefully, took it seriously, and then, at a dinner table in Washington, chose to test it himself anyway. Which was how, 11 months later, the Drenari High Assembly's newest and most promising junior ambassador found himself seated at a formal state dinner in Washington, D.C., staring at a small red pepper resting delicately on a plate in front of him, having been told by 3 separate intelligence briefings that eating it might kill him. Vesic Thera had not, technically, been sent to Earth to eat anything. He had been sent to finalize the first formal trade framework between the Drenari Assembly and the Human Concord Delegation, a painstaking 8-month process of negotiation that had, by the week of the dinner, finally produced a workable draft treaty covering technology exchange, shared research initiatives, and a tentative mutual defense consultation clause that human negotiators had fought hard to include. Given how recently the Colossi War had reminded everyone in the room exactly how fragile peace could be, those 8 months had not been easy ones. Drenari negotiating style, shaped by a culture that valued careful, incremental agreement over dramatic gestures, had frequently frustrated the human delegation's instinct to move quickly once a general direction had been agreed upon. Human negotiators, in turn, had more than once startled their Drenari counterparts by proposing changes to draft language on the spot, mid-session, in ways that Drenari diplomatic tradition normally reserved for formal written amendment cycles spanning weeks rather than minutes. Vesic himself had spent the first several weeks of the posting privately convinced that the human delegation's speed reflected carelessness rather than confidence, a suspicion he did not fully abandon until a marathon 11-hour session in month 3, when a human lead negotiator, exhausted and visibly frustrated after the 4th stalled discussion of a single supply chain clause, had simply put both hands flat on the table and said, "Ambassador, I don't need you to trust the process. I need you to trust that I want this to work as badly as you do. Let's find a version of this clause we can both live with. Right now, instead of writing 3 more drafts to say the same thing more carefully." It had been, Vesic later reflected, an unusually blunt thing to say to a foreign diplomat mid-negotiation. It had also worked, and it had planted, quietly, the first seed of the same instinct that would eventually lead him to pick up a pepper he'd been warned might kill him. The growing sense that this new species valued honest, direct action in a way his own careful culture sometimes mistook for recklessness, and that understanding them fully would require, sooner or later, meeting that directness with some of his own. The dinner itself had been arranged as a diplomatic courtesy, a chance for both delegations to relax, after months of careful negotiation, in an informal setting before the treaty's final signing the following morning. Human State Department protocol officers had spent weeks agonizing over the menu, working closely with a small team of xenobiological advisors to ensure nothing served that evening posed any conceivable risk to Drenari physiology, which, from what limited data existed, seemed broadly compatible with human food chemistry, but sensitive in ways nobody wanted to discover the hard way at a state function. Nobody on a human side had thought to ask whether the meal should avoid spicy food. It had genuinely never occurred to them that pepper heat might register to an alien delegation as a matter of galactic security concern. To the American culinary team assembling the evening's menu, led by Chief Culinary Liaison Officer Jonah Reyes, a career State Department chef who had spent a decade cooking for diplomatic functions, and had never once been briefed on a foreign government's classified threat assessment of his own cooking. A small dish of roasted peppers alongside the main course was simply a nod to regional American cuisine, nothing more. Reyes had, in fact, agonized over the menu for entirely different reasons. He'd spent 3 weeks working with the State Department's Xenobiological Advisory Team to strip out anything that might trigger even a minor allergic response in Drenari physiology, cross-referencing every ingredient against the limited biochemical data available, substituting a dozen traditional recipes to remove compounds flagged as uncertain, and rewriting the final menu twice after new guidance arrived from the advisory team with less than a week to spare. By the morning of the dinner, he privately considered the roasted pepper side dish the single least risky item on the entire table. A simple, mild preparation, roasted rather than raw, included specifically because it had cleared every biochemical screening with no flags at all, and because he'd wanted at least one dish on the menu that felt genuinely, distinctly American rather than deliberately neutral. He would spend a significant portion of the following week explaining, to an unusually large number of bemused colleagues, that the pepper in question had not, by any human measure, been particularly hot at all. Vesic Thera's staff had thought about it a great deal. However, because Drenari intelligence had shared the 11-month-old capsaicin threat assessment with every diplomat headed for extended human contact, including a specific, formal recommendation that Drenari personnel avoid consuming unfamiliar red or orange color produce at social functions until further biochemical study could clarify the risk. His delegation's chief of security, a broad-shouldered, humorless veteran named Desic Orn, who had served on 3 separate assembly postings and had personally briefed Vesic on the capsaicin assessment twice, raised the issue again just hours before the dinner, standing in the doorway of the ambassador's temporary quarters with the particular stiffness of a man who suspected, correctly, that his warning was about to be ignored. Elder Val's assessment stands until formally revised, Desic said. I would ask you not to accept anything from tonight's menu that has not been pre-screened by our own biochemists, regardless of how your host presented. I'm aware of the assessment, Desic. I read it before you were assigned to this posting. Then you're also aware it specifically names red and orange produce as high risk. I am aware, Vesic said, adjusting the formal collar of his diplomatic robes in the mirror, that Elder Val has never once left Osravel in her entire career, and that 11 months of secondhand data collected from waste processing facilities is not the same thing as understanding a species. I intend to understand this one, Desic. That is, in fact, the entire purpose of my posting here. Desic did not look reassured. And if the assessment is correct, if this is exactly the kind of psychological anomaly Elder Val warned about, then I will have learned something true about them either way, Vesic said. That has always seemed a reasonable trade to me, which meant that when the small dish of roasted peppers was placed in front of him that evening, Vesic Thera understood, with total clarity, that he was looking at exactly the substance his own government had spent 11 months quietly worrying was some kind of weapon. He should have declined it. Every rational, career-preserving instinct told him to smile politely, thank his hosts, and move his attention to literally anything else on the table. He was 34 years old, young for an ambassador, promoted early because of an unusual talent for reading unfamiliar situations quickly and correctly, and he had not gotten this far in Drenari diplomatic service by taking reckless risks with his own biology at formal state functions. But Vesic Thera had also grown up on the Drenari homeworld of Osravel, a planet whose entire cultural identity was built around a concept that didn't translate cleanly into human languages but came closest to something like threshold, the old Drenari belief, inherited from a harsh ancestral past, where physical hardship had once been the difference between a family's survival and its extinction. that meaningful things in life were found on the far side of controlled, voluntary discomfort. Drenari children were still, to this day, sent through ritual endurance trials during adolescence, extended fasts, cold water immersion, long solo treks across the homeworld's punishing highland terrain. Not because the assembly believed suffering itself had value, but because generations of Drenari elders believed something else, that a person who had never chosen deliberately to walk toward discomfort instead of away from it would never fully understand their own strength. Vesic had completed his own threshold trial at 16, a 9-day solo crossing of the Kessa Highlands that had left him with a scar across one shoulder from a fall he still remembered in vivid, uncomfortable detail. He remembered, too, exactly what it had felt like on the 9th day, exhausted and cold and further from comfort than he had ever been in his young life, to reach the crossing point and feel something he hadn't expected. Not relief that the suffering was over, but something closer to gratitude that he'd been the kind of person willing to walk into it at all. Looking at the small red pepper on his plate, surrounded by human diplomats making careful, polite conversation about trade tariffs, Vesic Thera felt something he hadn't expected to feel at a state dinner 11 months into the most important diplomatic posting of his career. He felt 16 years old again, standing at the edge of the Kessa Highlands, deciding whether to walk forward. "Ambassador Thera," said Secretary of State Elaine Brooks, noticing him studying the pepper with unusual intensity. "Is something wrong with the dish?" "No," Vesic said, and picked it up before his own better judgment could talk him out of it. "I am simply deciding something." He ate it whole. For exactly 2.5 seconds, nothing happened, and Vesic Thera allowed himself the briefest, most premature flicker of relief. Perhaps the intelligence assessment had been wrong. Perhaps his own species biochemist had overestimated the compound's effect on Drenari physiology. Perhaps this would simply be an unremarkable dinner after all. Then the burn arrived, and it arrived like nothing his threshold trial, his Highland crossing, or any hardship in his entire carefully disciplined life had prepared him for. Drenari pain receptors, it turned out, were not merely compatible with capsaicin. They were, if anything, more responsive to it than human receptors were, a fact no amount of remote biochemical analysis could have predicted, because it depended on a specific structural quirk of Drenari nerve chemistry that only direct exposure could reveal. The burn didn't localize to his mouth the way human diners had assured his staff it would. It radiated, fast and total, down his throat, across his chest, into the tips of all 4 of his fingers on each hand, a full-body cascade of signal that every Drenari medical instinct in his body screamed was the unmistakable prelude to serious tissue damage. His eyes flooded. His breathing turned sharp and shallow. Across the table, Secretary Brooks half rose from her chair, alarm playing on her face, already reaching for the emergency medical channel every diplomatic function kept on standby. Desic Orn moved faster than anyone else in the room, crossing from his security position near the wall in 3 long strides. One hand already reaching for the emergency medical kit clipped his belt, the other hovering near Vesic's shoulder in a gesture that was half support and half restraint, as though he intended to physically remove his ambassador from the table if the situation demanded it. He did not say, "I told you so." His expression said it clearly enough on its own. And Vesic Thera, tears streaming freely down a face that had not cried, by his own recollection, since the 9th day of the Kessa crossing 18 years earlier, began, very quietly, to laugh. It wasn't the reaction anyone in the room had braced for. Chef Reyes, watching from the kitchen doorway, where he'd come out specifically to check on the reception of his dish, felt his stomach drop the instant he saw the ambassador's eyes stream. Years of training screaming that something in his kitchen had gone catastrophically, publicly wrong at the most important dinner of his career. Drenari security staff moved half a step closer to their ambassador, hands twitching toward equipment none of them were fully sure would even help. Secretary Brooks was already saying something urgent into a comm unit. Vesic Thera raised one trembling hand, not in distress, but in the universal gesture, one of the very few that translated perfectly across species without any cultural context at all. That meant wait. I am, he managed, breathing hard, still laughing in short, disbelieving bursts. I am fine. I am better than fine. I do not have the correct word for this in trade standard. He looked up, eyes streaming, face flushed a color no human at the table had seen a Drenari complexion turn before, and found, with visible effort, the words he wanted. It burns, he said. It burns beautifully. Secretary Brooks lowered her comm unit slowly, uncertain whether she had just watched a diplomatic crisis or a diplomatic breakthrough, unable yet to tell which. Ambassador, she said carefully, are you certain you don't need medical attention? I am certain, Vesic said, wiping his eyes with the back of one hand, still catching his breath, that I would like a second one. The dinner that followed became, within days, the single most replayed piece of diplomatic footage in the short history of human Drenari contact, not because anyone had intended it to be recorded for public release, but because a junior State Department staffer with a personal recording device, present specifically to document the historic treaty dinner, had captured the entire sequence in real time, and once the Drenari delegation itself requested the footage be shared openly with their own government back home, there was no putting it back in a drawer. What made the footage extraordinary wasn't simply that an alien ambassador had eaten a pepper and survived. It was everything that happened in the 90 minutes afterward as Vesic Thera, still flushed, still occasionally wiping his eyes, radiating an energy the rest of his own delegation had never seen from their notoriously composed junior ambassador. Asked question after question about the dish, about the planet it came from, about why humans cultivated something that produced this exact sensation on purpose, and, most importantly, about whether there were other varieties and whether any of them burned even more beautifully than this one had. Chef Reyes, still half convinced he was about to be quietly reassigned to the least prestigious posting the State Department could find, found himself instead pulled into what became a genuinely fascinating conversation, translator device balanced awkwardly between them, about the Scoville scale, about the biochemistry of capsaicin receptors, about the specific human cultural traditions, chili eating contests, hot sauce collecting, entire regional cuisines built around escalating heat that had turned a plant's defensive toxin into a source of shared human pleasure and, frequently, shared human bragging rights. You compete, Vesic said, delighted, once the concept of a chili eating contest had been explained to him in full. You deliberately test each other. Publicly. For status. Pretty much, Reyes admitted. This is not so different from threshold trials, Vesic said, and something in his voice had shifted, the careful diplomatic reserve of the past 8 months giving way to something warmer, more immediate. We do not have your pepper on Osravel, but we have understood, for longer than your species has existed as a distinct people, that a being who chooses discomfort voluntarily for the sake of understanding their own strength is engaging in something sacred. I did not expect to find that same instinct in a species 11 months into formal contact. I did not expect to find it at a dinner table. Desic Orn, still standing close by, listened to the exchange with the particular silence of a man revising a lifetime of professional caution in real time. When Vesic finally noticed him and asked, half teasing, whether his chief of security intended to file a formal incident report, Desic's answer was quieter than anyone at the table expected. I intend to file an amended threat assessment, he said. Elder Vol will not enjoy reading it, but she will read it, and she trained me to report what I observe rather than what I expect, whatever the cost to my own predictions. He paused, glancing at the empty dish that had, an hour earlier, nearly triggered a diplomatic medical emergency. I did not expect this. I am willing to say so plainly. The formal report Vesic Thera filed with the Drenari High Assembly the following week did more to advance human-Drenari relations than 8 months of careful treaty language had managed on its own. High Analyst Corveth ISS, reading in full for the first time, found himself revising 11 months of careful threat assessment based on a single junior ambassador's account of a dinner party. Capsicin, Vesic's report explained, was not a weapon, was not evidence of a hidden acclimatization program, and was not, in any meaningful sense, evidence of unusual human pain tolerance at all. It was something the Assembly's analysts, for all their careful data collection, had never once considered as a possibility. A species that had independently discovered, through thousands of years of agriculture and culture completely disconnected from any known Drenari tradition, the exact same principled Drenari elders had spent millennia teaching their children on the slopes of the Kessa Highlands. That controlled, voluntary discomfort, chosen freely, without coercion, for its own sake, could produce something the body itself seemed to recognize as valuable rather than merely painful. That a species which had endured plague and war and its own worst instincts across its recorded history had arrived, independently, at the conclusion that walking toward difficulty on purpose was sometimes the most human thing a person could do. They did not weaponize suffering, Vesic wrote, in a line that Corveth ISS would later read aloud to the full assembly floor. They cultivated it, the way we cultivate the Kessa crossing, not to harm themselves, but to know themselves. I believe this species understands something about the value of a chosen threshold that most of known space has forgotten how to appreciate. I do not believe this makes them dangerous. I believe it makes them, in a way I did not expect to find so quickly, familiar. Elder Cressa Vol read the report twice before responding to it publicly, a fact her own staff would later describe as uncharacteristic for a woman known across the assembly for forming opinions quickly and defending them longer than the evidence usually warranted. When she finally addressed the floor, she did not fully concede the point. Cressa Vol was not, by nature, a woman who conceded points easily, but she did something almost as significant within Drenari political culture. She requested that Desic Orn's amended field assessment be entered into the permanent record alongside her own original warning, unedited, including his account of standing in a doorway hours before the dinner, insisting his ambassador was making a mistake. I would rather my caution be remembered as wrong for the right reasons, she told the assembly, than remembered as never having existed at all. Ambassador Thera's instincts served this posting well. That does not mean caution has no place in the postings that follow. It means on this particular occasion, courage arrived first and was correct too. It was, by assembly standards, as close to an apology as Cressa Vol had ever offered anyone in 40 years of service. And Vesic Thera, reading the transcript months later, found himself unexpectedly moved by it. Not because he needed her approval, but because he recognized, in her carefully worded concession, exactly the kind of honest reckoning with a chosen threshold that his own culture had spent generations teaching him to respect. The Assembly's threat classification on capsaicin was formally downgraded within a month, replaced with a research designation focused not on biological risk, but on comparative cultural study, an unprecedented shift in Drenari intelligence policy that several older Assembly members privately credited, with some discomfort, to a junior diplomat's willingness to eat something he'd been explicitly warned not to. Vesic Thera stayed on Earth for the treaty's full ratification process, an additional 4 months beyond his original assignment, largely at his own request. He spent a significant portion of that time, much to the amusement of the State Department staff who worked alongside him, systematically working his way through what Chef Reyes had begun jokingly referring to as the Ambassador's Threshold Tour. a steadily escalating survey of human hot sauces, chili varieties, and regional spicy dishes, conducted with the same careful, methodical diplomatic rigor Vesic brought to every other aspect of his work. He did not, notably, attempt every dish recklessly. He approached each new level of heat the same way he'd approached the Kessa Highlands at 16, deliberately, with full awareness of what he was choosing, treating each escalation as its own small threshold crossing rather than a reckless dare. The tour produced its own small collection of stories within the State Department, retold with increasing embellishment over the following months. There was the afternoon Vesic requested a bowl of Reyes's homemade ghost pepper chili, ate it incomplete, focused silence for 11 minutes, and then sat quietly at the table for a further 20, eyes closed, in what witnesses described as an expression indistinguishable from meditation, before finally opening his eyes and asking, with total sincerity, whether the recipe could be shared with the HFY Cultural Archive. There was the evening he attempted a scorpion pepper salsa at a private dinner with 3 junior State Department staffers, all of whom had assumed, incorrectly, that an alien ambassador with a documented tolerance for spice would simply eat it without visible reaction, and were instead treated to the sight of Vesic excusing himself for exactly 4 minutes, returning with his composure fully restored, and calmly informing the table that the salsa had been, in his professional opinion, as a threshold specialist, appropriately calibrated. When a junior State Department aide, caught up in the novelty of the whole affair, once offered him a dish rated, by human standards, dangerously and almost irresponsibly hot, Vesic declined with the same calm clarity he'd shown at the original dinner. "There's a difference," he told the aide, "between choosing a threshold and being pushed toward one you have not prepared for. My people learned that difference the hard way, long before we ever left our own homeworld. I suspect, given how carefully you label these bottles, that yours did too." That comment, once relayed back to Chef Reyes, became something of a quiet philosophy in the State Department's diplomatic kitchen for years afterward. The idea that hospitality, done correctly, wasn't about pushing a guest as far as they could go, but about respecting exactly how far they had chosen to go themselves. The treaty was formally signed on schedule, 4 months later than originally planned, but stronger for the delay. Expanded to include cultural exchange provisions neither delegation had originally proposed, joint culinary research initiatives, shared study of comparative endurance traditions, and, in a clause that made international news for reasons that had nothing to do with trade policy, an annual diplomatic dinner tradition held alternately on Earth and Osravel, where representatives from both species would share dishes significant to their own culture's understanding of chosen hardship. The first Osravel dinner, held the following year, introduced a small human delegation to the Kessa Highland fasting broth, a traditionally bitter, deliberately unpleasant dish served at the end of a Drenari threshold trial, meant to be endured rather than enjoyed in any conventional sense. The broth was served cold, in plain stone bowls, in a hall built centuries ago at the actual crossing point of the Kessa Highlands trial, where generations of Drenari adolescents had first tasted it after 9 days of hardship, a detail the human delegation understood, once it was explained to them, was itself a significant gesture of trust rather than a simple matter of tradition. Secretary Brooks, present for the occasion, ate her portion without complaint, understanding, by then, exactly what kind of gesture was being asked of her and exactly what kind of respect it would communicate if she chose it fully rather than merely tolerating it. The broth was, by every account she gave afterward, genuinely difficult to finish, bitter in a way that lingered, unpleasant in a manner clearly designed to be unpleasant rather than simply unfamiliar. She finished it anyway, slowly, deliberately, aware that every Drenari elder at that table was watching not to see whether she enjoyed it, but to see whether she understood what finishing it meant. Vesic Thera, watching from across the table, found himself thinking of a dinner in Washington a year earlier, of a small red pepper he'd been explicitly warned might kill him, and of how completely a single voluntary choice, burning, difficult, and entirely his own, had ended up reshaping the relationship between two civilizations that had, 11 months in a formal contact, understood almost nothing true about each other yet. He thought, too, of Desic standing in a doorway, and of Elderval's careful, reluctant concession on the assembly floor, and of how much distance a single shared meal, chosen freely by both sides, had managed to close in the space of a single burning evening. "It burns beautifully," he'd said, that first night, not fully understanding at the time how much weight those 3 words would eventually carry. He understood it now. Some of the most important bridges between strangers, it turned out, weren't built through careful negotiation at all. They were built the moment someone, against every cautious instinct telling them not to, decided to walk toward the burn instead of away from it, and discovered, on the other side, something worth calling beautiful.